Welcome, everyone. Robert Gregory, the CEO of the Australian Jewish Association. Thank you for joining us on our Wednesday night weekly Zoom session. We have a very, very important Zoom tonight. We have Dan Tehan, the Shadow Immigration Minister, and he's one of the strongest on a very strong shadow cabinet. And the topics he's going to be talking about on the minds of everyone in the Jewish community, because we found that the government in attempting to fight anti-Semitism has been doing everything except addressing one of the major root causes, which is the immigration portfolio. So Dan Tehan has been a minister. He's had quite a few ministries actually in multiple governments to do with defense, to do with education, trade, tourism. So he's an all-rounder, very experienced. Tonight's Zoom is going to be interview style. AJA President Dr. David Adler will be conducting the interview, and then we'll have a chance for some questions. If you want to ask a question, the best way is to raise your hand with the raising hand button. We might try and go to some new people, and we'll ask you to keep questions short. So over to David now to start the interview.
Okay, thank you very much, Robert, and particular thanks to the Honourable Dan Tehan. I think we had a discussion at a conference, Dan, called the ARC Conference, which is an important initiative by former Deputy Prime Minister John Anderson. And I thought, well, that's a good sign that you went to the ARC conference. And there was another good sign I've got to tell people about. And you'll remember that probably just 2 months ago, there was an Israeli family trying to come to Australia for a family event, the 100th birthday of a Holocaust survivor. And they were being held up through the increased scrutiny of Israelis coming to Australia. And Dan was very helpful in assisting with a little bit of pressure, which finally got one of them into the country. Unfortunately, the other ran out of time and had to return to Israel. But that's enough from me. As Robert said, at the Anti-Semitism Summit, Peter Dutton announced that the coalition would be much more active in immigration policy on a variety of issues that have been neglected by Labor. So, Dan, can you tell us in what ways will a coalition immigration policy be different to Labor? Dan, you're muted. Need to unmute again. Okay.
Yeah, thanks, David. And can I just say it's wonderful to be joining all of you tonight. I just wish there were better circumstances under which I was joining. When I was Australia's Trade Minister, one of the things that I was very keen to do was to continue to build the trade investment relationship with Israel. We began exploring the possibility of a free trade agreement. And I must say, the relationship was going from strength to strength. My previous role, when I was the Veterans Affairs Minister, I had the great honour of doing the centenary of the Battle of Beersheba. We went to Israel with a delegation because I was also the cybersecurity minister. I was privileged enough to be at a very informal lunch between Malcolm Turnbull, Benjamin Netanyahu, and myself and the Israel Veterans Affairs Minister at the time. We had lunch for about an hour and a half, and the relationship I don't think has ever been stronger. And to see now where we are now, I must say is really very, very sad. And to see what has happened, especially to the Jewish people in Australia, is nothing short of a disgrace. And it's something that I never, ever thought that I would see in my lifetime. And I must say, one of the things that I've been proudest about in my whole time, which is now nearly 15 years in the federal parliament, is the way that the opposition under Peter Dutton's leadership has come together to basically call out the Albanese Labor government for what I think has been an absolute failure of leadership to deal with anti-Semitism in this country. Now, there are a number of ways that we will seek to restore leadership in addressing anti-Semitism, the first of which Peter Dutton announced recently, and that is the establishment of an anti-Semitism task force. Now, this is going to be incredibly important, and I'm going to read to you basically what this will involve. I did this on radio the day after he'd made the announcement, but it's something that I think everyone needs to know. In creating this new dedicated anti-Semitism task force, which will be led by the Australian Federal Police and incorporate the Australian Security Intelligence Organisation, the Australian Criminal Intelligence Commission, the Australian Transaction Reports and Analysis Centre, it's called AUSTRAC, and it tracks funding between organisations and looks for any sort of criminal activity in funding. And as we know, there is a concern that funds are coming into this country to fund anti-Semitism, the Australian Border Force and state police. So we will set up this new task force, which will bring all these organisations together to fight anti-Semitism. We will issue a new ministerial direction to the AFP to direct them to prioritise addressing anti-Semitism, including any unsolved crimes against the Jewish community, such as doxing, public display of terrorist symbols, incitement, harassment, and other offences. We will direct the Anti-Semitism Task Force to refer any visa holders involved in acts of anti-Semitism for immediate cancellation or deportation. I'll just read that again. We will direct the Anti-Semitism Task Force to refer any visa holders involved in acts of anti-Semitism for immediate cancellation and deportation. And if necessary, we will amend the Section 501 character provisions of the Migration Act to ensure this anti-Semitic conduct is captured by the law and applies retrospectively for all acts of hatred towards the Jewish community since the 7 October 2023 terrorist attacks against Israel. We will also establish a judicial inquiry into campus anti-Semitism. As you know, that's already been announced. And we will deliver $32.5 million in a security funding package, as requested by the Executive Council of Australian Jewry, without any strings attached, including funding armed guards at schools and synagogues, unlike the Albanese government, who have restricted funding to unarmed guards only. And then we will commit $8.5 million to see the Centre of Jewish Life and Tolerance become a reality, and provide $7.5 million over 3 years in additional funding to Crime Stoppers to enable Crime Stoppers to expand its operations and protect more Australians from the devastating impact of crime in local communities and helping address the anti-Semitism and extremism crisis. And on top of that, and this will be something we will announce during the election campaign, we will also, within the Australian citizenship test, we will place a specific section which will deal with anti-Semitism, and we will have an educational module which will deal with anti-Semitism. So if you become or want to become a citizen of this nation, then you will have a specific section that you will need to undertake with regards to anti-Semitism. Now, this will be something that we will announce during the election campaign, and it will be very interesting to see whether the Labor Party will seek to match this or do anything in this regard. I think that will be incredibly important to really see and test how how committed the Labor Party is in this regard. But we want to ensure that anyone who wants to become a future citizen of this nation knows that anti-Semitism is something which is condemned in this nation.
Dan, that's very comprehensive and quite different and much more powerful than the government is currently pursuing with the problem. And a lot of those things, I think, you would have our strong support and assistance in implementing, should that be useful. Can I ask you about a closely related matter, which is something that has also shocked us since the 7th of October 2023, and that is overt support for prescribed terrorist organisations. As you know, we've seen on our streets flags of Hamas, of Hezbollah, of the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, and occasionally other terrorist organisations. What would be your view, your approach to someone who has been involved in some activity or some signalling that they are supporting a prescribed terrorist organisation?
Well, if they're not an Australian citizen, if they're a visa holder, then my view is that you would refer them immediately to our anti-Semitism task force. And the approach that I would be looking to see undertaken, and I think James Paterson, as the Home Affairs Minister, has said something very similar, is that we would seek to have their visas cancelled. If you're here on a visa and are supporting a terrorist organisation, then to my view is you're simply not the type of person we want in this country. And I would refer them immediately to that task force. Now, if they're Australian citizens, I think something that we are going to need to do is to see whether the law is strong enough in this area, where if people are actively supporting listed terrorist organisations, then I think we need to be able to take action. In one of my very first roles in the Australian Parliament, I headed the Intelligence and Security Committee. Tony Abbott gave me that honour when he was elected Prime Minister in 2013. And one of the things I fought very hard for was for us to introduce laws whereby for dual citizens, we would strip them of their Australian citizenship if they went and fought for terrorist organisations. Now, that was fairly controversial at the time, but that was something that I pushed very heavily. I think for this type of activity, for dual citizens, for those non-citizens, then we should be looking at taking very, very serious steps. And for those Australian citizens, and if that's the sole citizenship they have, I think we have to look at the domestic law to see whether it's strong enough when it comes to people who are advocating publicly for terrorist organisations, because it's not the type of activity we want to see in this nation. And if we are going to let that type of behaviour creep into our civic discourse in this nation, then we erode the very fundamental values that we have fought to uphold in this nation since Federation.
Well, for visa holders, for non-citizens, I guess it's more direct, but I think you're implying, tell me if I'm reading too much into it, that for dual citizens, you would also consider stripping them of their Australian citizenship because they're dual citizens, and deportation if they're involved in supporting a terrorist organisation. Is that correct?
Absolutely. I think that's something we should look at. And we did it when we were when we were previously in government. Now, the sad reality is there was a court decision which was taken about 12 months ago, which cast doubt on the government's ability to do this. My view is we need to look strongly at that court judgment, and we need to find ways whereby the government can legislate so that we can look seriously at once again being able to use the threat of stripping a citizenship away from dual citizens who undertake this type of behaviour.
Well, we've seen it blatantly. I mean, a few months ago, when Israel killed the leader of Hezbollah, Hassan Nasrallah, immediately on our streets were people carrying his portraits, carrying Hezbollah flags, and the portraits were actually nicely framed portraits behind glass. They're not the sort of things that you'd knock up in Officeworks in 15 minutes. So very likely been hanging in homes and offices and such. And I was shocked by that there are certain people who are regarding him as a hero. So that's a worry. Can I ask you about another subgroup that has been of great concern to us, and that is the government's decision to rush in the about 3,000 people from Gaza on visitor visas. And in our view, and in the view I'm sure of Israeli security services who know how hard it is to assess people from the area, there is no way you can do it in 24 hours or the short time. What's the coalition's view on the 3,000 visitors visas that have been issued to Gazans?
Well, first of all, we raised serious concerns about this at the time, and especially with regards to how any proper security checks had been undertaken in that period of time. And it became quite clear that they hadn't. And the serious concern for us is over time that this could have real impacts on the security of citizens here in Australia in the foreseeable future, and in particular the Jewish community. We will immediately seek to have the security checks that were undertaken examined to see whether there was proper and thorough security checks done. Now, my view is it's highly unlikely that has been the case, but we will be in a position to be able to determine that. And then we will obviously seek to see what can be done about that. The deep concern, David, which I think you would probably be aware of because we've sought to publicise this, because we knew that this was probably the motivation all along. The difficulty that we're now facing is that I think the latest data we had was at least about 70% of these people who came in on these tourist visas have now sought to claim asylum.
Mm.
And this was what we thought was what the Labor Party, speaking bluntly, were up to from the start. Get them here quickly on tourist visas, knowing full well that they would then immediately seek to claim asylum. And that, of course, makes, causes more serious concerns then about how you deal with them, process them. And, on tourists, if they're on tourist visas, then, obviously when it was safe to do so, they would return home. Now that they've claimed asylum, there is lengthy legal ways for them to basically use the system to remain here. So this is going to add a level of complexity to dealing with this issue now. But the first thing we will do is immediately have a look and review to make sure that all the security checks have been properly undertaken, because I think you're right, people have some very serious concerns in this regard.
Well, Dan, if hopefully within a matter of some weeks you will be minister, and I would strongly recommend that you speak to your Israeli counterparts and ask them about the work permits that they issued to people from southern Gaza to work in the kibbutzim. And in order to get one of those work permits, it takes months of scrutiny from the Israeli security agencies. And we now know that many of them were collecting data, intelligence for Hamas. And that's one of the reasons October 7 was so devastating. They had detailed information of all the properties, etc. So the Israeli security services failed. And it's inconceivable to us that bureaucrats in Canberra in 24 hours can do a superior job but that's a huge problem to learn all that.
No, it is, David. And when I visited Israel after October 7 and went down to the kibbutz, this was one of the issues that was discussed at the time, was how, Israel had opened the borders so that economic activity could be undertaken, so people could come, earn income, and obviously provide support back to their families in Gaza, and how ultimately, in the end, even though all the security checks had been undertaken, there was a failure in the intelligence to be able to detect this. And you're absolutely right. That is why serious concerns have been raised about how Australian authorities could have done something similar in the space of 2 days, rather than what happened with the Israeli intelligence services, where over a period of months they were still able to be deceived. So
yes,
you're absolutely right to say that this is an area we need to look at.
Okay, just a couple of quick points before we open up to general questions. We have in Australia a proportion of the Jewish community that are ex-South Africans, and it does seem that under the current government, if you happen to be a persecuted, say, farmer in South Africa, you're given a much, much tougher time than, say, if you're from Afghanistan or similar. What's going on there, and what would the coalition approach be to people from South Africa who wanted to come to Australia?
Australia's meant to have a non-discriminatory approach when it comes to who we welcome to our country. And one of the things which has alarmed me is that when I travel around the country and meet with groups, there does seem to be some sort of bias which has crept in towards people who have South African citizenship. Now, the cynic in me would say that that the Labor Party might be doing this for political purposes. I hope that wouldn't be the case, but there does seem to have been an approach which has been taken where it seems a lot harder now for people of South African origin to get on a permanent pathway to citizenship in this nation. Now, this once again would be something that we would look at when we come to government, because we are meant to have a non-discriminatory approach to citizenship in this nation.
Look, I think your cynicism is justified. That category of South Africans tend to lean more conservative politically, whereas the groups that seem to have the easier pathway into this country might vote against you. So I think cynicism justified. A very specific thing that's just arisen in the last 48 hours, we know that there were some Australians who went and attended the big Hezbollah event in Beirut, the funeral of Nasrallah. We're actually exposing more of them tonight and tomorrow, but some of them are documented, and they were not particularly smart. They were taking selfies there, etc., wearing Hezbollah gear, the whole works. What should the government do about those people that are currently in Beirut?
Well, I mean, the first thing I would hope is, and I'm sure that this would be happening, is I would imagine that all our agencies would be taking particular interest in this, because obviously, once again, it's deeply concerning. Once again, I think we should be looking very closely as to, you know, are these people Australian citizens? If they are, obviously, that needs to be looked at under a different light. But if particular these are non-citizens again, then I think, you know, the one good thing about setting up this anti-Semitism task force is that you would be immediately referring people to that task force to see, okay, what activities have they been undertaken, and is there a serious risk as a result, to our security here? Is there a serious risk that these people might undertake anti-Semitic actions going forward, and therefore should we be taking action against these people?
Well, we're at the halfway mark, so I'll hand back to Robert, and you can make any announcement or moderate Q&A.
Thank you, David, and thank you, Dan. That was a very, very informative first half. And I want to welcome everyone. I know we've got people watching and listening on a variety of forums on JA Community Radio, obviously the people on Zoom, people watching on Facebook Live, people watching the recording later on YouTube. Everyone, we're about to go to questions, so raise your hand. I can see we've got a lot of questions, so we'll get to whoever we can. I just want to, first of all, thank all of our supporters who are supporting AJA. If you would like to make a contribution, which we need, please do so on the AJA website, jewishassociation.org.au. Obviously, assuming everyone here is a member and following us on social media and subscribing to emails, all very important. Just want to flag a couple of events with people. Next week, we'll be running a special session on some of the grassroots organizations that are springing up in the Jewish community since October 7 to fight the left politically. We've seen very successful campaigns against the Greens in different states, and these movements are growing. They're grassroots. They're not organized by any of the big organizations, so it'll be an interesting session. Also, we'll be having small party forums. So we often have speakers from the coalition and other parties. I think it's important everyone hears from some of the smaller parties right of center. So in New South Wales on the 16th of May, we'll be having a small parties forum. We will have all of the lead Senate candidates see some of the parties here, Family First, One Nation, Libertarians. And in Victoria, we will be having a small parties forum the following week on the 23rd of March, also with an amazing lineup from these parties. And as we can see, David's sharing with us now this graphic. We can see the last 28 days, AJF Facebook alone has had over 6 million views, and he was actually telling me today, including X and other places, we're over 10 million views on the various social media. So it's been a very, very busy time for AJA social media. So make sure you're following us on all of those sessions. All right, now we'll go to some questions. Just a reminder, keep the questions very brief. One question per person, no statements or any questions. And we'll go to some people we haven't gone to first. First up, we have Bruce Hill.
Thank you. Bruce Hill from the Australian Jewish News. We've all seen the disgraceful scenes outside Granville Boys High in Sydney this afternoon. The Bankstown nurses, the National Imams Council's come out in support of it. You've been talking about immigration and letting people into the country. It's pretty clear we have a huge anti-Semitism problem that's been allowed to be homegrown for a long time. Harvey's actually written this question. I think it's the real interesting question. What can the coalition do to get existing immigrants to assimilate or acculturate into Australia?
It's a really good question. And I think what we've got to do is, first of all, provide the leadership that is required to say that quite clearly that anti-Semitism is un-Australian. And if we do that from the top and make sure that we will take action, then to ensure that people understand that the government and the leadership of this nation sees no place for it, and therefore it is what we expect from the broader community. That to me is the first thing that we need to be providing, because I think the worry from most people is that because it wasn't stamped down on to start with, and stamped down on very clearly, it almost gave a permission for people to undertake the type of activity that we've seen, which ultimately led, sadly, to things that we never thought we would see in our lifetimes, to bombings of synagogues, and the like. So I think the first thing we need to be doing is making sure that we're undertaking that type of national leadership, which we've failed to get. The second thing is, I think when we've got to investigate into education, and obviously we've said that we will put money towards that type of education. I think one of the great things that we've seen, sadly it's needed, but I think it's a very important response, is we're starting to see philanthropy money go into setting up institutions that will provide also that type of leadership when it comes to making sure that the Australian people are educated when it comes to, how if you let anti-Semitism prevail, the darkness that will come with that. My very good and close friend Josh Frydenberg, I think, has been an exemplar in providing the leadership in that regard. So I think that it will be also really, really important. And then I think we've just got to be prepared to use the full force of the law to clamp down on anti-Semitism as well. And, we obviously will need to work with state authorities to do that. But I think if there's national leadership, especially through the establishment of an anti-Semitism task force that incorporates state police, then I think we will see the law being used as well. And I think if that national leadership, making sure that we've got that educational piece in place and then using the law, I think that will be a very good start to making sure we're dealing with it.
John Lockwood.
Thanks, Dan, for all the wonderful things that you are doing, and the Lib coalition parties, and standing towards anti-Semitism. No doubt you are aware that there's been a recent relaunch of the Israel Allies Caucus in the Parliament under Andrew Wallace. And my question to you is basically, at this stage, we understand the coalition's policy is for a two-state solution that supports. And would you, and how would you reconsider that policy at this particular time to say it's a possible solution, but there may be others solutions to, and it's up to the state of Israel, which to my understanding, over 87% of the people say there's no way there can be a two-state solution. Your comments, please.
Very good question.
Look, it's our policy that the two-state solution is still what we should be aiming to achieve. But our position is ultimately incredibly different to how that is viewed by the Labor Party. That two-state solution has to, first of all, what we need is to see the preliminary conditions before you would look to implement that. And that is that Israel's right to exist is made very clear, and that all parties who you would seek to accommodate as part of a two-state solution would recognise and understand that that is the fundamental guarantee that has to come first. And so we would work with the Israeli government to make sure that all those preconditions are met before you would then look at a two-state solution. But that remains our position. I'm a member of the caucus, and have been since its launch. I must say Andrew Wallace has done a superb job in leading the caucus, And obviously, we would make sure if it went in government that we would continue to work with the caucus. But that policy position still remains our coalition policy position.
I'm going to take the president's initiative here, Dan. I'll talk to you another time, but our view, the Israeli view, and indeed the Arab view, if you ask them, is that there's no such thing. There is no two-state solution. Nobody in the Middle East wants it, not the Jews for security reasons, not the Arabs because they don't want Israel. We are so far from that concept now. It's only a leftover in some Western political discussions. But I understand the coalition policy. At least it's a little bit more realistic than the Labor one. But I will bet you any amount you and I will not see it in our lifetime, and nor should we. My statement.
And I think I noticed a few disappointed comments in the chat. And I think if people don't want the two-state solution, which is obviously very unpopular in the Jewish community, I think you need to speak to some of the Jewish organizations, because we can't expect the coalition to be more pro-Israel than some of our major Jewish organizations, which are still pushing a two-state solution. So I think that needs to be the next avenue. And yeah, thank you. Great question, John. Great caucus. And Andrew Wallace is also a good friend of AJA. So good. Alan, you're up.
Thanks, Robert, and thanks, Dan. Dan, every single Gazan is the product of an education system that glorifies what is being called Palestinianism. It's an ideology that teaches the kids there's no need to build a functioning society because the world will throw money at them as perpetual refugees, and they can instead focus on only two core objectives, which are to destroy Israel and kill Jews. And I'm worried that, as we saw today in Granville, the education system here is leading kids in primary school down potentially a similar road. So apart from tackling the universities, can a future coalition government take a serious look at the school curricula?
Absolutely. We've got to make sure that the tolerance and respect are absolutely at the heart of our nation. And if we don't do that, then we change our nation. And, we've all seen that if you allow hatred to prevail, what it ultimately can lead to. So I think we do need to once again relook at our school system and make sure that is at the heart of what our children are being taught. And if we don't do that, then sadly, I think what you see is an education system which, when I was education minister, you deeply, deeply worry that there is an underlying ideology that is being taught. And many of our state Labor governments, sadly, have been quite happy to go along with it. And so we need to act. And if we need to, then I think we need to look at the curriculum. There is parts of our curriculum where they have what is called cross-curriculum themes. And maybe we need to look again at, okay, do we need to make sure that respect for all cultures, respect for all religions are very much part of that. Respect for all ethnicities are part of that, because the idea that people would see that it in any way is permissible to single out a single race, a single religion, and target them goes against everything that this nation stands for. And so maybe we do need to look at our curriculum and go back and look, especially at primary school, how our children are being taught. Because, one of the great things about this nation is that it has been always welcome to all. And if we start moving away from that, or are prepared to tolerate people and moving away from that, we change who we are as Australians. And I do not want to see that.
Great. Next up, Josh, please unmute.
Hi, Dan. Josh Basara here from the Epoch Times. Just wanted to ask you, just in regards to the gang violence that we're currently seeing in outer Melbourne suburbs, such as Werribee and Cranbourne, how much can you relate that to too many newly arrived immigrants who have been, rushed into these expanding suburbs. And just to comment on Tony Burke's citizenship push, is that a vote buying exercise before the federal election?
Well, on Tony Burke first, the local mayors definitely thought that, and that's what they called him out on. And the fact that he was quite happy to strip their rights from conducting those citizenship ceremonies to do a mass citizenship ceremony himself and invite Labor Party MPs and candidates to that, and somehow, the independent candidate Di Lee as a deputy mayor, but was so-called issued her invitation through her local council role, but they failed to invite her as a member of parliament, just sort of, I think, goes to show the level of cynicism that Tony Burke and the Labor Party will show as we approach this election. When it comes to what's happening with regards to gang violence, in Melbourne, obviously it's incredibly complex, and the heart of it, though, I think actually goes to the Allen Labor government and Dan Andrews before that, their lack of ability to really enforce the police and the wonderful role that the police undertake through the weakening of the court systems in Victoria. It's a running joke now, sadly, here in Victoria. The police just basically watch people they've arrested go into court and then watch them come out again waving to them because basically the law is not being imposed on. And once people see that there is no consequences for their action, then sadly you see the type of behaviour that's been undertaken at the moment. And, we all know that when it comes to how you bring up your children, if they don't have a sense that there are consequences for bad behaviour, for bad action, then it's very hard to provide them with the type of parenting that's needed. And if we don't, as a society, say to people that there's consequences for actions, and especially criminal actions, then you get what you're seeing now on the streets in Victoria, and you're seeing in Queensland. And it's taken a new coalition government to come in there with law and order basically as their number one issue, and say that we are going to put a stop to this. And Brad Batten, as a former policeman, I think you'll see law and order will become, if not the top issue, definitely one of the top two issues, because the state Labor government is obviously sending the state broke. So there will be a question around debt as well. But I think just debt and economic mismanagement plus law and order will be the two issues that I think will basically decide the next election in Victoria as well.
Hazel, you're up.
Hi. I don't think you can answer this, but I'm going to say it anyway. Mike Burgess said at Senate estimates that anti-Semitism is the number one security threat. So what I'm asking you is, every time Mr. Albanese says that he's concerned and that anti-Semitism doesn't have a place in our society, would you and all the coalition members please say to him that one of the ways he can address it is by preferencing the Greens last? And please wedge them on that, because they are really a dangerous party and they shouldn't be in Parliament at all.
Look, that is a very good comment. And if I remember correctly, I think in our very last sitting week, which was 2 or 3 weeks ago, we put it to Anthony Albanese that if he seriously wanted to do something to address anti-Semitism, he should join with the coalition in putting the Greens last. And unfortunately, he wouldn't commit to that. And I think one of the frustrations that the Australian people have more and more with Anthony Albanese as Prime Minister, and at the start they were very keen to give him a go, is just his utter weakness and his inability to be able to answer a straight question. And it's gone from people sort of been a bit frustrated with it. I think now to people, and this is the feedback I get in the community, people have just absolutely had enough of it, and we're starting to see it in his popularity. He's now reaching the levels where people are really showing that they are angry with the job that he's doing, and I think it puts it down to that weakness and ability to fail to answer questions. And, on something like that, if he did say he was going to put the Greens last, I think people would say, hallelujah, you are at last showing some leadership. But sadly, I'm not expecting it.
And I think it'll be particularly interesting in seats like Josh Burns, where he's got a large Jewish electorate. What's he going to do about the Greens? Because he's never put them last before. Next up, we have Harvey.
Hi all, thanks for giving me the opportunity to ask a question. Look, I've noticed of late, and probably since the start of this decade, despite having on their website the LNP support free speech and small government, all their actions have shown otherwise, and in support of things like the hate speech laws, federally, anti-vilification laws, sans 4 words, I think it was, in the state level of Victoria, and support, I believe, of hate speech laws too in New South Wales. I don't see these laws as actually stopping anti-Semitism. Instead, they're fueling it by, and if they by making this a legal thing, all it does is it just pushes those anti-Semites underground, rather than being up front where we can see them waving around with their terrorist flags, portraits of terrorists and others. How will there be some sort of sunset clause added to this legislation in the future, or how is it all going to play out? I mean, we already had sorry to add one more thing. When the anti-Nazi laws came in, we had one person who was arrested straight away, and his whole shtick was to go recruit people in the jail to actually join his neo-Nazi cause. So, do you think these laws will actually help or hinder anti-Semitism overall?
Yeah, look, it's a really good question. As someone who has been a strong advocate of freedom of speech, as a matter of fact, one of the things I did at university was to get Robert French to look at freedom of speech and freedom of academic inquiry at universities for this very reason, is that the left was trying to almost shut down freedom of speech by dictating what was and wasn't allowed. My simple view of this is that freedom of speech is absolutely fundamental to our society, to any democracy. So when you are working towards putting in place anything which impacts on freedom of speech, you have to do it with the community. And one of the things that I would hope that, and I know that we would do, any moves that we look to take towards introducing anything which looked at hate speech and going down that pathway, you would do it with the Jewish community and other communities who you might be seeking to undertake to putting such laws in place. And getting the balance right is always absolutely vital when you're looking at anything like this. And here in Victoria, I know that's something that the coalition has been seeking to undertake, is to make sure they're doing it with very close consultation. Because you're right, some of these laws, all they do is drive the type of speech that you're looking to deal with underground, and it actually can make it more dangerous.
Yeah, I would agree that AJA has a different position than many other Jewish organizations. We're the only one that's spoken out against many aspects of these hate crimes laws, particularly ones in Victoria. I had an article in the Herald Sun about it. So there's definitely big concerns in the community, even though some of the other Jewish organizations say everyone's united behind it. And very interestingly, we've been dealing with, in the Northern Territory today, the Liberal, the coalition party there is actually repealing some of the laws there. So it's interesting for people to watch. It's going in the opposite direction. Not much time left. So many questions. Let's see how many we can get through. Next up is Ira.
Thanks, Robert. And thanks, Dan, for your proposal. It's very interesting details. And thank you, AJA and David. I have a quick question and a quick proposal related to that. The question is, what is the opposite of anti-Semitism? And that's for Dan tonight, but also for the Jewish community generally. And my proposal is that whatever is the opposite of anti-Semitism, that may provide some new solutions that we haven't really actively participated to work on.
Well, I mean, the opposite of anti-Semitism is obviously tolerance for all. And that's what we want to see. The idea that an ethnicity or a religion will be singled out for hatred, for violence, is just simply and utterly wrong. And we've got to do everything we can to make sure that doesn't happen. And that's so. The opposite of anti-Semitism is a country which I think we largely had before October 7, and that is where everyone is welcome, including the Jewish people, and that's and the Jewish citizens here in Australia go about their life, practice their religion, practice or undertake education in a way that the Australian community welcomes, and that they've got the freedoms to do that. And that's basically what we want to make sure this nation goes back to. And sadly, many Jewish people now in Australia feel like that this country has moved away from that, and that is something that we just utterly cannot tolerate.
Okay, next up we have Shane.
Yeah, g'day, Dan. We met last year when I was holding a protest at Parliament House about the housing crisis. I won't ask you about that tonight. I want to ask you about anti-Semitism and social cohesion in Australia. I've seen members of the federal Labor government state that far-right extremism is the greatest threat to our democracy. But when I see the protests like on Australia Day with the protesters waving the Palestinian flags and wearing kaffirs and chanting "kill the Jews" and "gas the Jews," they look like far-left extremists to me. These are the same people that want to burn Australia to the ground and decolonise. Now, our media and government denounce the far-right protests, like the one that happened in Adelaide on Australia Day, as vile, disgusting and despicable, as rightly they should. However, I don't see the same level of denouncing of the far-left protests from the media or the federal Labor government. Is that because our institutions like mainstream media, universities, government departments like the police are run by people who are sympathetic or identify with these far-left protesters?
Great question.
Yeah, look, it's a really interesting question, and I think it's hard to sort of speak in generalities, because what we tend to see, for instance, within the Labor Party, someone like Josh Burns will call it out. Within the media, you will see people within the Age, Sydney Morning Herald, within Fairfax, who will take a very strong stance on what they'll see from the far left when it comes to anti-Semitism. But I think you do have a tendency to see a tolerance towards anti-Semitism on the left that you don't see on the right, and I think that's the thing that concerns everyone. And sadly, and look, I've got to be a little bit careful here, but I think one of the things that we've probably all found a little disconcerting is that with a Prime Minister who represents a seat where the threat comes from the Greens rather than from the Coalition or the Liberal Party, I think we've all worried that it's been that has potentially led to that lack of real strength in addressing anti-Semitism after October 7. And so I think definitely there is on the left, there isn't that strength that's required, but I think it's hard to put it to in gross generalities, because you do see amongst the left, some members of the left, I think, an understanding as well of the dangers of anti-Semitism and where it can lead this nation. But I think it would be fair to say, from the current politics, that the coalition, I think, has been far stronger since October 7, really from day one, in calling out anti-Semitism than we've seen from the Labor Party. And I think it's fair to say that the way the Greens have dealt with this is absolutely frightening and has basically been un-Australian.
Well, I think on that note, that's all we're going to have time for in terms of questions. Apologies to the people we didn't get through, including some of our regulars. Hopefully we can get back to you next week. Before I hand over to David, just to finish up, I want to thank you, Dan. That was an excellent talk. We don't endorse politicians, but I think, it's pretty clear that almost everyone in the Jewish community wishes you're the immigration minister in a few weeks' time. It would be a very different situation for Jews in this country. So thank you for an excellent discussion and talk and for your policies. And over to David.
Dan, I also want to thank you very much for making the time available to us. I know you're in your car, you've been campaigning today, even though the election has not been formally called. We are sort of in an election campaign. And for the people who haven't seen your opponent, this is your opponent, a male teal, and sometimes you can tell a little bit about a person's values just by looking at their social media. And here he is holding up an object. I'm not sure if it's a scented candle or something. This smells like my vagina. So if we have the choice between Dan Tehan with his values, experience, principles versus the alternative, it's a no-brainer, Dan, and we wish you every success.
Thanks, David. And there's something also that you should be aware about. When he was a Triple J presenter, he was party to a terrible segment around Adolf Hitler. And it took him about 14 years to apologise for that. And it's something that other I think should also be aware of. And his co-presenter at the time, Tom Ballard, as you would know, just recently in the last 12 months has been doing comedy skits where he has been using the Nazi salute. So, obviously very, very concerning behaviour.
Yeah. Well, thank you. You did speak about education a bit. We have had Sarah Henderson as one of our guests, and we also think that in that portfolio, there's a big difference between the coalition and Labor, and a big positive difference. Thank you, everyone, and we look forward to seeing you all for next week's event. Good night, all.